Hi, everybody, and welcome back to A Catholic's Perspective, the podcast all about being a young Catholic surviving in a secular world. Today, I have a special guest with us. I have Sean McMahon, who you might know on YouTube or Instagram as a wonderful musician. And Sean, we've been trying to do this interview for quite a while, so I'm so glad we can finally do this interview.
Thanks for having me on, Amber Rose. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, and this computer on my screen.
hmm
Yeah. No, that's awesome. And for my listeners who might not know who you are, would you mind just giving a quick introduction for them?
Sure. So I'm Sean McMahon. I used to be on the internet under the persona Workman Song, which was kind of a indie rock moniker slash band name. I actually retired from Instagram and all things meta recently.
Oh,
So
really?
harder to find that way. You can just find me as Sean McMahon. And what I've been up to these days is mainly just music and ministry. I do a lot of theological podcasting. I do a lot of hymn writing as well as secular music still. I converted to Catholicism along with my whole family. Got my wife and kids to get baptized with me in 2023, and I got there by being a Baptist pastor, which started in 2020. I was a pandemic era pastor, kept that church open and alive through the pandemic. And before that, I was a Rolling Stone living on the road. I lived in Brooklyn, New York. I did the thing. I know all about the culture. I lived it. I breathed it. I did that for about 10 years living on the road. In the words of Towns Van Zandt, living on the road, my friend, was supposed to keep you free and clean, but now you wear your skin like iron and your breath's as hard as kerosene. So that was the life I lived, and I loved it. And I was actually Christian during that period on the road too, but I was progressive Christian, which allowed me to justify that lifestyle. So I had a heck of a journey. And before I was Christian, I was agnostic, pseudo Jewish. My mother's Jewish, so I was a secular Jew. So that's all to say, I would have never expected to be who I am today. If you'd asked me 20 years ago, when I was like a self righteous, secular person, someone who actually threw down, this is shameful, but I threw down a rosary that my best friend had bought from the Vatican gift shop in the Vatican because I was
I
so
bet he
self
looks at you
righteous.
now and is just like,
He would have been shocked looking at this guy. If he looked in the mirror and known that he was going to become me, he probably would have been really scandalized.
no, that's awesome. And you said that your mother was a Jew. What kind? Or
Yeah, she's a Galician Jew. She's descended from I think she was second generation American, so she's descended from Galician Jews, which is it's from that disputed area that we call Ukraine, that we call Russia, that we call like Czech at
right.
times Austria, I think,
So
kind
then
of.
how did you get introduced to Christianity through that? Did you find it on your own or?
Yes, but obviously, with help. So, in college, when my stone began to roll, I got interested in spirituality, mainly, the popular stuff at the time, New Age. I mean, I'm in New England, so there's not much of a pervading Christianity here. What was popular in my specific area of New England was Tibetan Buddhism because there's a big Tibetan
Mm.
diaspora. So there's a lot of Buddhism, led to mysticism, and so I was into consciousness studies, which was in vogue. And so that's what got me into religious writings. And I became aware that there was a little bit of that in the Kabbalah. So I said, okay, maybe I'll get a little bit into Judaism. I thought monotheism was kind of lame. I just had this really, I had a bias against Christianity first,
Mhm.
and then probably Islam second. And then Judaism, not so much because I knew it's where I was from, and that's why I was open to reading what I considered cool Judaism, which was like Kabbalah, and um, then I started reading the actual prophets, the Torah and the prophets, and that's when things started to change when I started reading the Jewish stuff. That came from my mother's mother. She
Mm.
introduced me to Jewish culture.
That's awesome. So then was that happening while you were doing your music and you were being a Rolling Stone, or was that kind of after you put that life away kind of thing?
So college was my seeking years. I went to New England Conservatory of Music, so I was supposed to be focused on music, and I was just reading all the time. And I was hanging out with my grandma who lived down the road, my mother's mother. So she was giving me all the Jewish stuff. I had a great friend named Jenny who was Catholic. And so I was talking about Jesus with her. And I was becoming amenable to the idea that Jesus was a wise man.
Hmm.
I thought that I'd come out the other end kind of being sort of like a Eastern guru who I thought I could become equal to Jesus. Such was the conception of Jesus that was popular in my college years, in the things I was studying at that time. Um, and it was after college that I started to open up the New Testament for myself with an open mind, because I was reading some stuff in the prophets, especially Daniel, that pinpointed when Messiah was going to come. And I started to realize that was the first century AD. So I decided to give the New Testament a try, and that's when I started getting convinced. That's when I entered an evangelical church, which I lasted a year in before I kind of rebelled and wanted to like go back into the kind of more liberal antinomian way of looking at things. And I moved to Brooklyn, and there's a bar church movement that was
Bar
popular.
church? What is
Bar
that?
church, a church where you celebrate, in my case, an Anglican mass celebrated by a blue-haired female priest, um, with like old-time shticky rock and roll liturgical music. It was very weird. There
I'm
were sleeping
bewildered.
bells and also mimosas during the. It
Mimosas.
was crazy.
Wow, we got to up our game after mass with coffee and donuts to mimosas and blue-haired liberals. No, I'm just
It was super interesting. I mean, it kept me tethered to Christ. By that time, I wanted to be Christian, and
kidding.
I was able to tell people like, "Hey, I'm Christian, but I'm still cool,"
Mhm.
And then when I was going on tour and coming back to churches like this, no one was judging me for the type of stuff I was doing, like drinking and women and all that stuff. No one was judging me, and I'll say this: I look at it like it's an outer gate into the heart of Christendom. It's I was sort of like a leper and a beggar in terms of the inner sanctum of the New Jerusalem, but I was trying to stay close. And, as much as I disagree with that type of ecclesial community now, I still see it as some like a vine, like it's a way to stay in touch with Jesus. So I don't discredit it entirely because I was able to tell myself I always have this church home to come home to, and they're never going to judge me, and they'll always talk to me about Jesus. So
Yeah.
it was an interesting experience for me.
That makes sense. I think it's interesting too how there are so many paths to Jesus. And I don't mean that as in like religions. I mean that as in like
Right.
everybody's path is different as to how they can find Jesus. And going through what you did, and it's really hard going against the culture and against society. And I think especially today it's gotten so much worse in a lot of ways where now everybody cries judgment if you just don't want them to like do horrible things to themselves or to others. But how did that impact your relationship with Christ as you were kind of moving through this? What made you leave the evangelical and into more of the Baptist, or was there other stuff in between?
Well, the evangelical church was almost an accident. When I decided I need to follow Christ, I just pushed away all the preconceptions that I had about church. I threw it away, and I decided, God, I'll go to the first one you kind of send me to, and somehow I ended up at this church plant, and so I was like one of the first of like five guys involved with this Acts 29 church plant, and they signed me up as the music director, worship leader right away because I was a music school grad and I was a shoo-in for the job. But I discovered pretty quickly that, in our theological discussions, something wasn't clicking with what had led me to Christ, as someone who approached Christ through the Old Testament and found him in some ways the same way they might have found him in the first century, only knowing the Old Testament. So I found a lot of things confusing, which I've since unpacked. But that's all to say, there's a lot of theological stuff going on. Um, and interestingly, I had a Greek Orthodox priest mentor at that time,
Oh,
who came into my life randomly because he was the father of a guitar student of mine. So he introduced me to the church fathers and the Eastern, like ascetic practices and writings of the Eastern Church, and that kind of that was kind of the beginning. That's when I,
mm,
I kind of put that in its own compartment. I said, this kind of makes a little more sense to me, but I already got this job as a worship leader, and we drink beer and stuff like when we have Bible studies with these guys, and the evangelical church was cool, but I had this whole other thing going on where I really, really wanted to just be a rock star. So,
mm,
when these men, the 4 or 5 of us men were getting together and we're talking about our faith life, and these guys are talking about vows of chastity and like success against like pornography, right? I
mm,
wasn't there. Like these some of these guys have been brought up Christian, and I was not there, and I had girlfriends, and I just didn't want to let go of any of that stuff, and I wasn't convinced yet that I needed to be to let go of it. So I sort of just busted out. I just said, well, I'm gonna just pursue the rock star thing, and try my hand. I'm gonna move to the city and move to Brooklyn, and that's how I left the evangelical scene. And
okay.
I kept my feet in the Jesus pool by being at these sort of alternative churches. But the more I went into the rock and roll lifestyle, like I didn't get like hooked on heroin or anything. I never tried it, but like in retrospect, like the drinking was so heavy that I thought was just pure fun. And
Mm,
the promiscuity was was soul crushing in retrospect, but exciting at the time. Like that's how blind you can get. Um, so I would say that I was just so in it, so in this world. I really didn't come out of it until I basically became a father. You know,
mhm,
I met my wife. We were aligned on a lot of values, but she was a Rolling Stone when we met. Our first child was out of wedlock,
mm,
and we nonetheless we met in a church because we were both professional singers. So we met midnight mass one year, and it was just by the grace of God that us meeting at the time we did, like two Rolling Stones coming together, we were able to kind of immediately say like, hey, let's like pursue nobility, and I was a little further down the Jesus path than she was, at least in my studies, but I wasn't there in terms of my lifestyle by any means. But I was a 30-year-old man at that point. And God did not make men to be alone, loner Rolling Stones
mhm.
by the time they're 30. So he made us to be married, most of us. Some of us are meant to be celibate. But once he put me in that situation where I had one woman and I had a child, we got married. The grace of that sacrament, I think, is what saved me.
Mm. Yeah.
I don't have any other way to say it. Like that's what transformed me because there's nothing else that was really keeping me on that sanctifying walk. So I'm 37 years old now, an aging millennial, and I have so much to say about like the indie rock world, and I have so much to say about the values that my generation was brought up with, in terms of the secular culture. And
Yeah.
my wife is 5 years my junior, and she's basically a millennial too. But we're just looking at Gen Z and be like, don't make the same mistakes. Don't believe all the stuff you're taught. We're homeschooling our kids.
That's
We're
awesome.
we're looking at things so differently, and that change happened so rapidly when we met one another, and we were surprised by the grace of God in the sacrament of marriage, and like even more surprised by how that accelerated when we were received into the Catholic Church 2 years
Yeah.
ago.
No, that's beautiful, and I think especially when you find, your husband or your wife, they help you grow in that, whether they realize it or not. And like you said, through the sacrament of marriage, it really is a powerful sacrament. Like you guys are bound together until death to love and serve each other. And that's so powerful. And so I love that. Now you guys have another little baby. You said 3 weeks ago or
1 week ago, our
1 week
third
ago.
baby, 1 week ago.
That is adorable. I just that is so amazing, and like you guys have this beautiful conversion story into Catholicism which we'll get to, but I also you brought up the, like being a millennial, being raised in that secular type of thing. I want to know more about that, about what you witnessed in this Rolling Stone movement, what you saw in hindsight, and how you see that kind of repeating in other generations, or what you wish other generations could avoid. If there's anything that you think of, like just like off the top of your head, that you're like, oh, this, you know?
Well, the when I became a Christian, I was in the closet. I mean, that's how much pressure I had internalized to not be a Jesus person. Like I only started wearing crosses and like Jesus merch, recently. So I have this memory, and I'd have to paraphrase it, but I think like my mother walked in on me praying or something, and it was like she walked in on something else, and I explained to her, I'm going to this church, this evangelical church, and they're not really paying me, but I'm helping them start this church. She was just mind boggled. What are you doing? And she said something to the tune of, "This would be a lot easier on me, Sean, if you'd come out of the closet as gay."
What?
And I think that's where our culture's at. Like
Mm,
we can have this idea of this intrinsic nature that's within us, that is expressed through a sexual identity, now gender identity, 10 years later. But um, and people applaud you coming out, saying I have this new identity based on this set of practices,
mhm.
that I you know do in relation with other people. Um, but if you come out and say, I think I have a new identity based on the grace of Almighty God, and I'm going to do everything I can to be made worthy of the promises of Christ that have been given to me. Um, Most people can't acknowledge that reality, right? So they can acknowledge the Gnostic reality of a separate person within you that's a different gender, or has somehow it's a soul that is in conflict with what your um, procreational facilities are, in your body. That's fine. But the idea that there's something within you that's transcendent, that's geared towards God or godliness, or somehow that doesn't compute.
Mm,
So I find that interesting because it's in some ways it's the same idea, right? It's almost like a satanic co-opting of that idea that the soul is within, and it has its needs in spite of whatever's come going into the man, right? So chalk that up to materialism, but chalk that
mm.
up also to you know cultural Gnosticism that we have. um, I think I saw Sebastian Morello, who's a Catholic thinker. He called it Cartesianism, basically.
Yeah.
Like the idea that it's all up here, and what I think, therefore I am. Not God made me, therefore I am. Right.
Yeah.
Uh, so
Descartes was a special guy.
yeah, very
He's the one that
special.
did, "I think, therefore I am," and it's like, he actually Descartes, when he said that, he actually went to, um, a shrine and thanked God for this revelation that he exists just because of what is around him, and I'm just like, as I'm reading the book, I'm just like, "Oh," but anyways, go on, yes.
So strange, right? Um, but that's all to say. I mean, that's such a fundamental model of reality,
Mhm.
Cartesianism or what have you. I was brought up with that. I was brought up with that, and I had very little outlets to express my own, spiritual questions as a child. Where do you go when you die, etc. And by the time I was elementary, middle school, I think like the '90s born again movement was kind of starting to happen.
Yeah.
and it was being lampooned in the media, and people were talking about how problematic it was, and people were, you know, talking. I remember seeing the news stories on TV where they'd interview the kids saying, well, they can believe what they believe, but why do they have to force it on me? Why do they have to tell me to believe it or that I need to? And that was the sympathetic string that was played. So that resonated with me. That's what I learned from TV. Like, okay, you know, no one has the right to influence what I think or believe, which is
Right.
hilarious because I was a public school kid, like constantly being told what to think and what to believe. So layers upon layers of indoctrination is how I look at it now. You know,
Mm.
I'm 37, and I do see some of the Gen Z kids because of the internet, you know, some of the younger kids uh, having access to alternative ideas, watching debates. Like they're thinking a little more free than my generation did. Um, but I don't know. It depends on where they take it. All I know is that I'm seeing some of these kids start to come to conclusions that I didn't come to until I was in my 30s.
Right. I mean,
and
they
and
have the
as a art teacher,
resources.
there's kids out here I'm talking to like in elementary school who already get it. They already get it. But that's
Mm.
great.
Yeah, I think it's crazy because we have more information at the tips of our fingers today than I think any generation ever has in their lifetime. And that can be used for good or it can be used for evil. And despite the fact I think we can get bogged down by the amount of negativity we see on social media from my generation and younger Gen Z's, I do believe, like what you're saying, a lot of them are able to think for themselves a little better. At least the iPad kids aren't really in that group, but at least the kids that you know um are actually genuinely looking for truth and
Mm.
beauty, and maybe they don't know that they're looking for that, but they have the resources to go out and find it. Not great to have like unrestricted resources to go find those things, but I've definitely noticed that with Gen Z and then now Gen Alpha, which is a whole nightmare in itself. I know some Gen Alpha kids, and like some of them are genuinely like the sweetest kids I ever met, but their friends, like everyone at their school is just like you're saying, indoctrinated iPad kid, cannot function properly. Your kids are Gen Alpha technically, right?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and so it's like homeschooling them, giving them the faith as a resource, like all that stuff is so, so important. All these kids are, I feel like they're trying to, I mean, some of them are way too young, but a lot of kids feel empty. A lot of kids just feel like they're already a cog in the public school machine.
Hmm.
And they want something more, but they don't know how to get it because they were never taught. And so with this online world, it can be dangerous, but there's also a lot of opportunities for them to learn, which I know I didn't really have growing up. I had more of a millennial childhood. I was born in 1999, so I have more of that weird in between childhood. But as you were going through all of this stuff and trying to figure out Christianity, of course, and being a closeted Christian. How then? So, okay, so let me get this straight. So, you were originally in the evangelicals, and
Yeah.
then you were a closeted Christian for a while, went to Brooklyn, were rock and rolling, and then then you got into the Baptist, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay. And then from there, how did you continue your walk with your wife and now your child into the Catholic Church?
Well, the seeds were already scattered, if not planted, by the time I was called to pastor at the Baptist church, which is interesting because I
Hmm.
remember going to the first Catholic mass I was able to go to in mid 2020. They did one outdoors, and I went to that. And like 2 days later, I got the call that the minister at the Baptist church that I'd been attending was stepping down, and they wanted me to come in, and they pulled me from the pews. So that was a very interesting conflict because I was kind of flirting with Catholicism already, and at the same time, by that time in my life, I sort of wanted to retire from rocking and rolling, and I kind of dreamt of being a pastor or being in ministry. You know, a lot of people have a vocation uh, to ministry, but a lot of young men, especially, we just assume that it means getting in the pulpit. You know,
Mm. Mhm.
so that's what I wanted, and I have a love of theology, so I couldn't say no. You know, it's just like, okay, well, you know, let's see if the church actually calls me, and if they actually call me, I'll do it, because I was also very motivated by, you know, the needs I perceived in my community, because Martha's Vineyard, where I live in Massachusetts, in New England, was so strict about the pandemic. Like, I lost my music career
Oh,
that year.
wow.
There was just nothing. I had no work, no work except for a couple secret, you know, events.
Yeah.
Um, so I was sort of becoming more actively engaged in advocacy and activism of a more spiritual bent, because I was really preoccupied with how afraid everyone was, and it just made no sense to me. And so I got called in to the pulpit, and I got to keep this church's doors open when no other church was meeting on the island at the time.
Mm.
So it was hard for me not to process that as something that was important and, you know, appointed by God. And I wouldn't have done it if I had been fully convinced at that point anyway, right? So it was mainly preparing sermons every week for 3 years in that church that
Wow.
plunged me so deep into consistent Bible study that I just kept noticing these patterns that, one, I'd put into my sermons, saying, hey, like this little thing, it's kind of like what they did in the third century, you know, in the
Mhm.
Catholic Church. Um, and I would keep dog earing these little points, and it just became this laundry list of proofs for Catholicism, basically. And I think that's what did it. It was just the sheer volume of that type of thing. And alongside my pulpit ministry, I was doing online podcast theological studies on fulfilled eschatology, which is to say how, you know, Jesus and the church fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament.
Hmm.
And I did one on Isaiah 126. I will restore your judges and elders as they were in the beginning. And I and 12 parts later, I was like, oh, this is about the papacy. This is about the papacy and apostolic succession. And wow. So that's when I was so convinced that I gave a sermon to my church saying, listen, I'm going to become Catholic. This is an independent church. So hypothetically, I could probably still be your pastor if you want me to be, you know, like, but consider this my 5 weeks or whatever if you don't want that. And of course that they didn't want that. In the Baptist church, technically there's no hierarchy, but there are powerful personalities and people in the community, and they're like, you can't have this
Right.
Catholic. They're very Catholic phobic. So that's how that happened. There was a lot of theology involved. What I did know is that there was going to be a lot of supernatural stuff and challenging stuff involved with becoming Catholic. And the fact that my wife went along with it, to me, was pretty amazing, somewhat surprising, but mostly amazing. So that's all to say. Easter Vigil of 2023, I knew that a lot was going to change after we emerged from the baptismal waters. I got conditionally baptized because I don't really know if or when I was ever baptized.
Right.
Um, and, you know, God just works on you. He just kind of massages you once you enter the Catholic Church. I don't know what it's like to be brought up Catholic. I know plenty of people become utterly indifferent to the faith, so I don't know what it is. But my family was pretty engaged and excited about it. So, you know, we gave God a little, and He gave a lot back.
Mm.
And you know, we love our priest. He's, you know, he's traditional. He's good. We don't have like anything as traditional as a Latin mass, but he says what needs to be said. He talks sometimes about how dogs aren't cats, you know, stuff like
Valid.
that.
Yep.
Yeah, you follow. And you know, it's a very life giving relationship we have with the church. And I don't know. I still play music. Like, I still play rock and roll, but I'm writing more hymns. Like, my heart is way less in the world. Like, every day, my wife's heart is way less in the world. Uh, we're more about the business of God every day, I think, especially as our family grows. And I, I I keep saying this to every young person I know. Like, man is not really meant to be alone.
Mhm.
Unless you're called to that celibate life, chances are a lot of God's vocation for you is going to be found in your marriage and in your family. And, there's nothing like being a Catholic family under the patronage of St. Joseph. Something just happens.
Today is
Something.
actually the feast of St. Joseph when we're recording this.
Amen. Yeah.
So there you go. But yeah, I think I mean, it's so beautiful. And when you did come back into the faith and your wife and your child followed you guys, and how did that end up impacting your music? Because you still play music, you still have a band, and you
Yeah.
do that. So how did that kind of come about? How were you like, oh, now this needs to be for God and I need to change this?
It's something I navigate and negotiate with all the time. Like, on the one hand, playing music is like tent making, the analogy being St. Paul, like subsidizing more godly business, shall we say, with just a skill. So
Mhm.
I'll provide entertainment at restaurants and I'll provide entertainment at bars, but also I work in hymns. I work in songs that have, like songs like Spirit in the Sky from the 60s, like have some Jesus stuff in it. And I write what I call parable songs. So, our Lord taught through stories. And so
Mhm.
I try to write stories in my songs that might get to people who don't want to hear the word God, who don't want to hear about Jesus. So, I value the gift of music, and I try to not jump off the cliff entirely, and like end up like St. Francis, like naked in the city square, just like, whatever, I'm never
Yeah.
gonna, so the craft of music is important and it's a gift. And I try to be very careful of dividing secular from sacred, because Christ is king. And so
Mhm.
that distinction is laughable, actually. Um, so that's part of why one way to say it is straddle sacred and secular. On the other hand, the industry, that's a whole other thing. I just wrote a Substack
Yeah.
article about this. Like, there is supposedly the music industry, and then there is supposedly a Christian music industry that's separate from that. But actually, that Christian music industry, for the most part, is just like a couple months behind the main music industry
Mm,
stylistically, and Jesus is slapped on it. And then the sound of that music basically advertises the secular music industry stuff.
I
And
see.
all told, like that, the Christian music industry that most of us have access to, um, or that's touring the big venues, like this is all the same business as the music business. So I think that's kind of messed up. Like, the way I conceptualize it and express it in my Substack article is, the music industry found this ingenious way to advertise its music to Christians
Yep.
with, with Christian bands that are probably pretty, earnest about it. But then on top of that, in creating the Christian music industry, they've also insidiously separated it and saying
Yeah.
like, yep, now we have an excuse to keep all the God stuff out of our part of the industry, and it can be funneled into this controlled opposition, basically.
Right.
And at the same time, you go to a Christian music concert and you're buying through, like, Live Nation and stuff, then you're still funding stuff that you don't necessarily want to fund. So, you can exercise some discretion in this, right? Because Romans 13, it says, like, pay taxes to whom taxes are due. And in some ways, it's just unavoidable that you're going to end up paying some money to the beast, as just to survive. But from my part, I've become more fiercely independent as a musician over the years, just because, like, I really tried to get into that world. I sidemanned in bands that were in the indie music world, which is like way less creepy than
Yeah.
that, like the
Yeah.
Kanye stuff where he's like, they're drugging me, all this.
Right.
Like, indie music industry is very innocuous by comparison, but they still have to maintain relationships with these bigger conglomerates that are seeking to control all this stuff. And So again, the Substack article I wrote is called "Song and Dance People," and I summarize how like everyone always told me just cut the Jesus crap, just stop talking about him so much in your music, because I'd write these songs like that were kind of indie friendly, but then I'd just be like, and then Jesus said this, or I
Yeah.
bring it to things, and people always told me don't do that. Like you're killing your chances of having a music career in the music industry. And now, I thank God that I killed my chances of that because being independent is great. And Winston Marshall, the guy who got canceled from Mumford and Sons, he said like, when you take the risk to live honest, it easily trumps trying to live a dream, but like keeping your mouth shut. So I can say
Mhm.
what I want to say, and I'm out there like it's really innocuous, honestly. I'm just making like theological podcasts and posting sermons. Like someone once said, like if I had been doing this like in the between the 30s and even the early 60s, like this would have been a very popular and normal phenomenon. Like even Johnny Cash was making Christian albums and
Yeah.
in movies and preaching and all this stuff. But by the time Bob Dylan became a Christian, it was not cool. People walked out on him for preaching Christ. Um, it's like, yeah. So I've developed the a certain critique of the music industry, and I look at it more like a community that I probably shouldn't be involved in. Relationships that would be dangerous to me and my family, compromising, and
Mhm.
overall just inconvenient. It's like why sacrifice my freedom in Christ to get engaged in business relationships with people who don't really want me doing what I like to do anyway. That's kind
Yeah.
of how.
No, it makes sense. And I mean, having that independence is so important because otherwise, these people control what you say, they control what you do, where you go, who you're friends with, what your beliefs are. And we see that so often, not just in the music industry, but in Hollywood in general, where people cannot authentically live out their faith or be, Christian without being, dragged through the coals for it, or they have to, or they get, blackballed on, certain projects and stuff where they won't get hired because of their beliefs, or they won't do certain shows or certain movies because they don't want to kiss someone else or do a sex scene or something.
Mhm.
And we're punished for it. But like what we see the lives of these secular celebrities, these secular musicians, and we see the life they live, and we realize how not just degrading it is, but how soulless and how sick these people are. Not like sick as in like, like, oh, they're sick and disgusting. It's more of like sick, like they're spiritually sick. um and they have a lot of depression and they have a lot of anxiety, and so being able to write your own music and have your own channel and everything like that, because you have YouTube still, right? I know you said you got rid of Meta so people can't find you
Yeah,
there, but
yeah.
but
That mainly I'm on YouTube and Substack. That's kind of how I stay in touch. It's just more meaningful contact, long form.
yeah.
Anything form is always going to be a little more conducive to meaning, and it's just a better language for me. I still have stuff on streaming platforms, Spotify, etc. But most of my releases are on Bandcamp now because that's more
Okay.
sustainable. I know it's more of a pain for some listeners because you like to playlist. I totally get it, but it's more sustainable for my family, frankly.
Mhm.
To sell music on Bandcamp, and then yeah, Substack, Bandcamp, and the YouTube. And by the way, at any moment, like these guys could, not like my recent like Christ is King tweets, or they could, you know,
Yep.
sometimes I get into some hairy conversations with people, when they ask me like, how did you convert from Judaism to Christianity? And it gets into the supersessionism
Mhm.
conversation. Like, oh, you know, if I had maybe, four times as many followers, maybe they'd want to kick me off the platform for some of these things that, for what it sounds like. But
Yeah.
but whatever. Real life is better anyway.
Yeah, no, it is. And honestly, cancel culture is so old these days. I got dragged through the mud for saying, we shouldn't have prolonged adolescence, where it's like you need to grow up and not be spending thousands of dollars on Legos every year and actually find your God given vocation. Like, if you have kids, you enjoy that stuff, like, that's awesome. And, whatever, but it shouldn't be an obsession. It shouldn't be like, like obscene escapism or anything like that. It's like we all need to grow up. Stop,
Mhm.
doing that stuff, and I got dragged through the mud for that, so
It's weird. I mean, and I think people will, because I've heard this, people will say like first world problems, dude, whatever.
Mhm.
Like, yeah, but if we don't put our feet down now, then we'll have third world problems because, like, look no further than Syria right now, right?
Yep.
Stuff happens all the time, and it doesn't really take that long for that shoe to drop. If you allow this sort of resentment to fester, in just the form of first world problems, like, tackle that ignorance now,
Mhm.
because most people only give Christians crap out of ignorance. It's just it's not the easiest conversation, but compared to what can happen as anti-Christians gain more power and ascendancy, it's like, just deal with the weed when it's small, because next thing you know, like, your garden wall's breaking and everything's, getting flooded with death. So
Literally.
yeah, I think these small conversations and people getting upset about one tiny point, whether you even meant it or not, I think it's important that we're all prepared as
Mhm.
Christians to answer, and to, not to be too defensive, but to be on offense, saying, okay, have your attention. I'm going to preach Christ now.
Yeah.
Like, because the fact that you're doing this is evidence that you need him.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I completely agree, and like you said, it's like if we're constantly, um, you know, I guess ridiculed through ignorance, it really does not take very long for that hatred to build up and for things like what's unfortunately happening in Syria right now to happen. I mean, and like it happens in Congo all the time. You hear priests getting kidnapped, nuns getting killed. You hear about all this stuff and you just think, wow, how can I take my faith for granted when I see all of this? And I think part of that is being desensitized to the world and what we see online and just being like, oh, just another day in the world. But it's like, no, these are real people, these are real situations. And um, I'd like to think that America is far from that, but we're just as susceptible as any country to this type
Mhm.
of thing. We saw the church burnings back in 2020 and stuff when that false allegation came out about the skeletons found in Canada or whatever. And then there were a bunch of church burnings that happened. And turns out that was completely fake, but no news media, nothing to clear our name or nothing to do anything. It was just like, oh, sorry. Anyway, moving on. So, yeah, it's really important that we do speak truth, even in the face of injustice or in the face of persecution, because at the end of the day, this world is our ship, not our home, in the words of Saint Therese of Lisieux. So, but what kind of projects are you working on currently?
Focus is on producing regular Substack content. Rolled into that is, for my paid subscribers, like a song a week project. Um, it used to be fully produced songs every week that I'd slap on Spotify, but like, being in the basement between my headphones with a newborn upstairs while my wife is homeschooling three kids, that's not as sustainable. So I'm putting it through the paid tier of my Substack song a week project every Friday. That's mostly been hymns lately. So that's my active engagement. I play almost every night here on the Vineyard. I'm a live musician, and I try to live stream a lot of these on YouTube. And I pretty much almost exclusively produce theological studies on my YouTube channel. Right now, I'm in the middle of a "How the Papacy Fulfills Prophecy" study, which I it's cool. I'm getting some emails from Protestants like, "Oh, I never thought of this." So, I I'm just sort of continuing my ministry in whatever outlets are available to me at this time. But it's always been the same thing. It's music and ministry, music and
That's
word.
awesome. What is your channel name and stuff so that people can find you after this podcast?
So you can find me on YouTube at Real Sean McMahon. You can find my website at www.realseanmcmahon.com, and Substack is linked there, and that's mainly it. You can find me on Spotify and stuff. Wherever I put music, it's probably still there, like littered in a disorganized fashion. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, I really do appreciate you coming on and sharing your story finally after a year and a half of trying to do this and all these technical issues we've been having and then the time change problem we had this morning. But yeah, no, I just really appreciate you coming on here and sharing with my listeners. I know that they'll enjoy this episode and they'll be able to get to know you better and hopefully check out your music.
Yes. Well, God bless you and God bless your listeners, and keep on doing this walk we do. Thanks for the encouragement, and I hope all you out there listening find some gems and some ways to proceed in this hurdy-gurdy world, because it's wild out there, and things are getting wilder. But stay optimistic and trust God. God wins. Christ is King.
For real. Yes. No, so true. Well, thank you again, Sean. It's been an honor to having you on here, and hopefully your music career continues taking off. Keep posting on Substack and all that stuff.
Thank you very much. God
Of
bless.
course. And with all of that being said, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode and you guys learned something. Don't forget to go check out Sean's YouTube and his Substack. I'll link it all below in the description for you, and I'll talk to you guys in the next one. Do you have questions or comments about today's episode? Email me at thereligioushippie@gmail.com or leave a voice message at anchor.fm/thereligioushippie. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Please be sure to rate and review this episode. This podcast is produced by Amber Rose and distributed by Metacortext Publishing. This podcast is copyright by The Religious Hippie, NFP. Any previously trademarked or copyright content is used by permission. Information and opinions in this podcast should not be construed as medical advice. Please be sure to visit the official website for The Religious Hippie at thereligioushippie.com or find me on social media for other unique content. Thank you.